We all know that peace agreements ending civil wars are incredibly fragile. Most of them collapse within just a few years, plunging countries back into conflict. But what if I told you there was one factor that could make peace 35% more likely to last? And it's not expensive military aid packages or cutting edge peacekeeping technologies or even a bigger UN budget. According to a 2015 study of more than 180 peace agreements signed between 1989 and 2011, published by the International Peace Institute, the key factor is meaningful participation of women in the peace process. So if the data show us that including women makes the peace more durable, why have the vast majority of peace agreements negotiated in history excluded women? In a field obsessed with achieving stability, why would we ignore one of the most effective ingredients? Feminist theories of international relations offer an answer, and that's what we're exploring today. In her foundational text, Bananas, Beaches, and Bases, Cynthia Enloe poses a powerful question. Where are the women? It sounds simple, but it's revolutionary. Enloe isn't just asking about peace talks or political office, though this is certainly also an important question. She was asking a more fundamental question. Why entire fields like international relations ignore the daily lives, experiences, and labor of women? Where are the women in diplomacy, in military strategy, in our textbooks? In 2015, Elle UK magazine produced a series of photos with the men removed, and the images are striking. From meetings of the G20 leadership at Buckingham Palace, to debates in the British House of Commons, to a meeting of the U.S. National Security Council, the signing of the Democratic Republic of the Congo Peace Treaty in 2013, and ironically, even to Emma Watson's speech on women's rights at the United Nations, when we remove men from the picture, there are surprisingly few women in significant positions in global politics. According to data from UN Women published in early 2025, only 32 countries have women serving as head of state or government. While roughly half the world's population are women, just over 1/4 of the parliamentarians of the world are, and only 6 countries, Rwanda, Cuba, Nicaragua, Andorra, Mexico, and the United Arab Emirates, have legislatures where women comprise at least half of the representatives. By contrast, at least 19 states have legislatures where women comprise less than 10% of the members, and 3 have no women at all. And so, Feminist IR begins by making the invisible visible. It asks, whose experiences count in global politics, and what do we miss when we only look at war, diplomacy, and trade through the lens of state leaders and generals, most of whom are men? Feminist approaches to international relations don't just add women to existing theories. They rethink what counts as important in world politics. They challenge us to see that global power doesn't just reside in war rooms or summits. It also lives in households, refugee camps, and informal economies. That the global starts at the level of the everyday. And they interrogate the gendered assumptions that are baked into traditional theories. Why is rationality often considered masculine? Why is diplomacy about competition rather than cooperation? Why is caregiving framed as irrelevant to international security? For Feminist IR, these are not abstract questions. They help us understand why women's voices still so often are excluded from peace-building processes, even when their inclusion would demonstrably improve outcomes. But it's important to be clear. Feminist IR isn't just a call for more fairness or inclusion. It's a full-fledged theoretical framework, one that offers its own explanations for how power operates, how conflict unfolds, and what produces both violence and peace in the global system. Like realism or liberalism, Feminist IR makes analytical claims about how the world works, but it starts from fundamentally different assumptions and asks different questions about power, knowledge, and security. Feminist IR is grounded in a few key assumptions that reframe how we think about the international system. It challenges the boundary between the public and the private, between what's traditionally seen as domestic and what's international. Think about it. Mainstream IR tends to focus on big, visible events, wars, treaties, diplomacy. We just need to look at the global news headlines to get a sense of this. But feminist IR scholars argue that the same power dynamics that shape international negotiations also shape family structures, labor divisions, and even access to healthcare or education. In other words, the personal is political and international, and the unpaid care work that women do, that's essential for the functioning of economies. The gendered impact of war and sanctions, that's not a side effect, it's how global power operates. Before we go any further, it's worth taking a moment to clarify two terms that we're going to be using a lot: sex and gender. These are often used interchangeably in everyday speech, but in feminist theory, they have very different meanings. Sex refers to the biological characteristics, things like chromosomes, reproductive organs, and hormones. It's often treated as a binary, male or female. Gender, by contrast, is socially constructed. That means it's not something we're born with, it's something we learn. It's the set of meanings, explanations, and behaviors that society attaches to ideas of masculinity and femininity. And those expectations can vary across culture, across history, and even from person to person. Feminist scholars have long pointed out that gender isn't a simple binary. It exists on a spectrum. Some people identify as men, some as women, others as non-binary, genderqueer, or something else entirely. What matters here is that gender is not biologically determined. Rather, it's a product of cultural, political, and social norms. And that makes it deeply political. It shapes not just our personal identities, but our institutions, our policies, and our international systems. Feminist IR asks us to consider how these ideas about gender are built into the global order, and what happens when we stop treating masculinity as the default for leadership, power, and security. Patriarchy refers to a system of power in which men, especially certain groups of men, hold disproportionate control over political, economic, and social life. It's not just about individual men having power over individual women. It's a whole structure that organizes society in ways that normalize male dominance and make gender inequality seem natural, inevitable, or apolitical. In patriarchal systems, masculine traits like aggression, dominance, and independence are valued and rewarded, especially in politics and international affairs. Feminine-coded traits like empathy, interdependence, and care are devalued or dismissed as weak or irrelevant. And this system operates not through laws or institutions, but through culture, language, and even theory. Feminists maintain that patriarchy teaches us who gets to speak and be taken seriously in international negotiations. It tells us who should lead and who should listen. It shapes everything from war strategy to foreign aid to the very categories of rational actors and national interests. Patriarchy is not a single uniform system. It manifests differently across societies and intersects with race, class, and colonial history, as well as sexuality. But what unites these versions is the privileging of masculinity and defining who holds power and whose voices are silenced. Feminist IR scholars maintain that we can't fully understand global politics unless we first come to terms with the idea of patriarchy, and the dismantling of patriarchal assumptions is essential if we want to build a more just and peaceful international system. Feminist IR sees gender not as a synonym for women, but as a system of meaning and power that shapes how we understand roles, behavior, and legitimacy in world politics. Masculinity tends to be associated with traits like aggression, rationality, and strength, qualities rewarded in military and diplomatic spheres. And femininity is often tied to empathy, cooperation, and care, qualities frequently devalued or dismissed as soft. These gendered ideas are built into the institutions and assumptions of global politics, and for feminist IR theorists, that means that IR isn't accidentally biased, it's structurally gendered. Feminist IR argues that states are not objective, gender-blind entities. They are deeply gendered organizations that rely on gendered norms to function and legitimate power. For example, militaries often rely on idealized images of manhood to recruit soldiers. Nations construct narratives of protecting women and children as justifications for war, and peacebuilding often marginalizes women's voices even though they disproportionately bear the consequences of conflict. This lens raises questions about who speaks for the state and whose security gets prioritized. As scholars like J.N. Tickner have argued, if realism's national interest is based on elite male perspectives, then what are we missing? Feminist IR scholars often rely on different theoretical methods to answer these questions, tools like ethnography, discourse analysis, or personal narrative. That's because they're often studying informal power, lived experiences, and stories that don't show up in statistical models, but are no less important for understanding global politics. And finally, feminist IR theories encourage us to redefine power. While traditional IR links power to military might, economic dominance, or coercive capabilities, feminist IR broadens that definition. It sees power as relational, not just about domination, but about cooperation, interdependence, and resilience. It views security as human centered, including freedom from gender based violence, access to food and healthcare, and safety in the home. And it maintains that these aren't just idealistic add ons, they fundamentally change how we think about what international relations is and what it could be. So, now that we understand the foundational assumptions of feminist IR, how it redefines concepts like power, gender, and the state, let's take a closer look at the diversity within feminist approaches and how they apply to real world global politics. Like other major theories of international relations, feminist IR isn't monolithic. It's a vibrant, contested field of ideas with a range of perspectives that build on and challenge one another. That said, feminist approaches share a concern with questions of the exclusion of women from global politics and the emphasis on masculinity in international relations. That is, they share a conception of the world rooted in their analysis of patriarchy. And remember that feminist IR is part of a broader family of critical theories alongside Marxism, postcolonial theory, and constructivism that challenge dominant assumptions of mainstream IR. What sets feminist IR apart is its focus on gender and the systems that enforce it. Liberal feminists have much in common with mainstream liberal approaches to IR. They tend to focus on inclusion and increasing women's participation in international politics, especially in diplomacy, peacekeeping, conflict resolution, and development. For liberal feminists, the most important questions center on ensuring women's equal access to institutions and decision-making spaces in international politics. For example, liberal feminists have made important strides in promoting women's participation in diplomacy and peacekeeping, implementing legal reforms and quotas for gender parity, and adopting policies that promote education, representation, and protection, though, as we noted above, significant work remains to accomplish these limited goals. Key liberal feminists include Charlotte Brunch, who helped bring feminist issues into the global human rights debate, and Elizabeth Prugel, who studies how gender mainstreaming has and hasn't changed international institutions. Liberal feminism's strength lies in its making gender visible within formal structures, but its critics argue that it focuses too narrowly on access without challenging systems that maintain inequality. Radical and critical feminists take a more structural view. They argue that international relations is built on deeply patriarchal foundations that normalize domination and violence. They ask, what if global politics isn't just unequal, but fundamentally unjust? What if the entire international system is built on patriarchal foundations? These scholars critique the militarization of security, the normalization of gender-based violence, and the use of masculinized metaphors like hard power or penetrating markets in foreign policy. They argue that we can't just add women into existing systems, that we need to transform those systems to be more just, inclusive, and humane. One influential voice here is J.N. Tickner, who critiques realist assumptions about power and security, reframing them through relational and cooperative lenses that prioritize human well-being and asking, whose security are we securing? Marxist feminists argue that gender-based oppression is inseparable from capitalism. They focus on how women's labor, especially unpaid reproductive labor, sustains global economic systems. In international relations, this means interrogating how global capitalism depends on the exploitation of feminized labor, how colonial and neocolonial systems shape gender divisions of work, and how the global economy obscures or devalues care work. Marxist feminists demand we move beyond surface-level gender parity and instead confront the material foundations of gendered inequality. Maria Mies is a key figure here. In Patriarchy and Accumulation on a World Scale, she explains how capitalist development relies on the systemic exploitation and invisibilization of women's work, both in the global north and south. Postcolonial and transnational feminists critique the Western-centric bias of both mainstream IR and some feminist theory. They ask whose voices are being centered and whose are being erased in our global conversations. Chandra Mohanty's work is exemplary here. Her influential essay, Under Western Eyes, criticizes how Western feminists often portray women in the global South as passive victims. Postcolonial feminist scholars tend to emphasize the legacy of colonialism in shaping gender roles and institutions, the impact of global capitalism and the war on women in the global South, and the need to listen to grassroots, indigenous, and decolonial feminist voices. This strand insists on intersectionality, a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw to describe how gender interacts with race, class, nationality, and more. Intersectionality reminds us that power doesn't operate along a single axis. A woman's experience of war, migration, or economic inequality will be shaped not just by her gender, but also by her race, class, nationality, sexuality, and so on. Feminist IR uses this lens to make sense of global hierarchies that are otherwise invisible, and as a result, they argue liberation must be contextualized, localized, and rooted in lived experiences. Finally, poststructural feminist IR challenges the idea that gender is fixed or natural. Instead, it sees gender as a discourse, a way of organizing meaning and power through language, symbols, and norms. These scholars ask, how do dominant narratives define what it means to be a man or a woman? And how do these narratives justify certain policies, wars, or exclusions? Judith Butler's work on gender performativity has been influential here, showing how gender is constantly performed and regulated. And in international relations, Lenny Hansen has applied poststructural feminism to security studies, showing how saving women from violence is often used to legitimate military intervention without actually addressing the root causes of gendered harm. It's important to remember that feminist theories don't just critique, they also offer new ways of seeing the world and solving problems. And we can see this across a variety of contemporary issues in global politics. Let's return to where we began, peace processes. As I noted at the start, according to the International Peace Institute's study of more than 180 peace agreements, when women participate meaningfully in peace negotiations, agreements are 35% more likely to last 15 years. Why? Because women tend to advocate for broader social inclusion, human rights, education, and long-term community well-being, all areas that are essential for sustainable peace. Yet, women make up only 13% of negotiators and 6% of signatories in major peace processes between 1992 and 2019. Feminist IR reveals how the gendered structure of peacekeeping, who speaks and whose priorities count, directly affects outcomes. Liberal feminists argue for more inclusion. Critical feminists ask how the system of conflict resolution is itself masculinized and exclusionary. Or consider the global economy. Feminist IR asks, who does the work that makes the world work, and who benefits from it? Millions of women in the global South work in precarious, low-paid jobs, often producing goods for export or providing care in transnational households. That process of housewifeification and invisibilized labor of women we considered earlier. Meanwhile, wealthier countries benefit from this labor without recognizing it as political. Migrant domestic workers in places like Singapore, the Gulf states, or the United States send remittances that support entire economies, but their rights remain largely unprotected. Or think about how we define security. Traditional IR focuses on military power and threats to state sovereignty, but feminist IR asks, whose security, from what threats, and at what costs? Lenny Hansen shows how narratives about saving women from violence, especially in Muslim-majority countries, have been used to justify war. Think of the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, framed in part about liberating Afghan women. But as Judith Butler might argue, this is a form of gendered spectacle, a way to produce legitimacy for violent intervention without addressing deeper power dynamics in relations or material harm. Instead, feminist IR calls for a human-centered security paradigm, one that values freedom from hunger, violence, and ecological collapse just as much as freedom from foreign invasion. Feminist IR also teaches us that gender-based violence isn't just a tragic side effect of war and instability. It's often used as a deliberate tool of political control and domination. In many armed conflicts, sexual violence is systematically deployed to terrorize civilian populations, destroy communities, and reinforce ethnic or political hierarchies. We've seen this in Bosnia, Rwanda, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Myanmar, and elsewhere, as gendered violence is used to assert control, humiliate enemies, and fracture social cohesion. Feminist IR highlights how these acts are not private, apolitical crimes. They're strategic instruments of global politics, and yet they're rarely centered in traditional IR theory. By foregrounding these patterns, feminist scholars argue that security doesn't just mean borders and weapons, it must also mean freedom from violence, especially for those most often made invisible by the international system. Finally, consider that Feminist IR also brings a gendered lens to environmental issues. Who's most affected by climate breakdown, food insecurity, or resource conflicts? Often, it's women, especially in the global south, who are disproportionately responsible for food production, water gathering, and caregiving. Ecofeminists like Vandana Shiva and Ariel Saleh argue that the logic of domination over nature mirrors systems of domination over women, indigenous peoples, and the poor. These examples show how Feminist IR opens new pathways for understanding and action. It redefines what counts as security, it surfaces the politics of care and labor, it challenges the silences around gendered violence, and it reminds us that those at the margin of power often hold the keys to more just, lasting peace. Like any important theoretical approach, Feminist IR has sparked debates from both outside and within the field. One of the most common criticisms, especially from traditional IR theorists, is that Feminist IR focuses too much on the local, the domestic, or the personal. Critics argue that in focusing on everyday life, Feminist IR misses out on the most important issues in global politics: war, diplomacy, state behavior, global trade, and so on. But Feminist IR responds with a powerful insight. The international is built on the everyday. Who cooks the food that keeps soldiers alive? Who raises the children of migrant laborers? Who becomes the targets of military protection or violence? As Cynthia Enloe puts it, international politics doesn't just happen in presidential palaces, it also happens in the kitchens, in the barracks, and in the factories. Some scholars argue that Feminist IR doesn't make testable predictions or produce clear models in a way that realism or liberalism does. Essentially, they contend that Feminist IR may be good for critique, but it doesn't really explain international relations. But Feminist IR scholars maintain that the theory does more than critique. It reveals patterns of violence, exclusion, and inequality that other theories miss. For example, feminist analyses predicted that post-conflict peace processes excluding women would fail more often, and the data has backed that up. Another critique, sometimes even from inside the Feminist IR community, is that the field is too diverse and too fractured. With so many strands, liberal, postcolonial, Marxist, poststructural, it can feel disjointed or even contradictory. But most feminist theorists assert that this diversity is actually a strength. Feminist IR doesn't offer a one-size-fits-all list of solutions. Instead, it invites multiple perspectives, especially from historically marginalized communities. As Chandra Mohanty reminds us, no single feminist theory can capture the full complexity of global politics. Feminist IR is plural by design because power works differently in different contexts, and theory should reflect that. Finally, some critics argue that Feminist IR is more activist than analytic, that it's normative, value-laden, and not objective. But this critique often reveals more about the status quo than about feminism. Like other critical theorists, feminist scholars maintain that all theory is political. Realism and liberalism make claims about how the world works and about what kind of power matters. Feminist IR simply makes its values explicit rather than pretending to be neutral. As J.N. Tickner once wrote, feminists claim that the supposed gender-neutral, objective world of the realist is, in fact, a world constructed from a masculine perspective. It is a partial description of international politics that is presented as a universal truth, a truth that reinforces the subordination of women in the real world. Tickner reminds us that realism's claims about objectivity is itself a political move. It privileges elite, often Western male experiences as the baseline for what counts as rational and universal in global politics. In this view, realism isn't neutral at all. It's an ideological project that presents elite, masculine concerns as universal truths while dismissing other ways of knowing in the world. So, yes, Feminist IR is political, but so too is every theory that tries to explain and shape the world. Feminist theories help us see what traditional approaches have ignored: the unpaid labor that sustains economies, the gendered hierarchies of diplomacy and development, the many ways violence and power operate through everyday life. And while Feminist IR doesn't offer a grand predictive model, it offers something arguably more valuable: a lens that challenges, expands, and reimagines what global politics can be.